All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Dean Yates. Dean, welcome.
Hello, Guy.
Thanks so much for being here. So Dean led the Reuters teams that covered the 2002 Bali bombings and the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia's province. He was deputy bureau chief for Israel and Palestine in 2006 during the Lebanon War. He was Reuters bureau chief in Iraq, responsible for 100 people from 2007 to 2008. It was during this time that a U.S. Apache gunship killed 2 Reuters journalists in Baghdad on July 12, 2007. He's got a new book coming out mid 2023. Okay. And he says, while he focuses on those occupations, the book contains messages for anyone living with trauma and mental illness and their loved ones. He says he believes the story is a powerful testament to having a strong support network. It might be tough to read. It's also uplifting. And he says he hopes it will inspire and bring about change. Dean, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Guy.
So, all right. Before we go in here, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Yes, I'm from Australia. I'm from a little country town in New South Wales, tiny little town, cement-making town. No one would even know where it is on the map. It's probably a bit like an American small town that no one would even notice it if they passed through it. But now I live in Tasmania, which is maybe, I don't know, more familiar to Americans because that cartoon character, the Tasmanian tiger, is very familiar to you folks. And anyway, I live in this beautiful island state, which is just a gorgeous place to live, right at the bottom of the Australian continent, and it is a paradise.
Awesome. So let's dive in here. How is it that we are here talking today?
Look, in some respects, Guy, it's amazing that I'm alive because of the trauma that I experienced as a journalist working overseas. I went through some of the biggest news events of the last 20 years. You just mentioned them then. And I actually thought I was really tough. You know, I thought I was the quintessential detached journalist who could just switch off these things and get through it and move on to the next story. And what I didn't realize, and what I think a lot of journalists of my generation didn't realize, was that sort of trauma eventually catches up with people. It caught up with me. And in 2016, I became suicidal. All of this trauma had accumulated over time, but it was in particular the deaths of my staff in Iraq. Those 2 journalists who were killed by the Apache gunship in 2007, that really affected me a decade later. The guilt and shame of that event, the fact that I had not protected my staff. I was the bureau chief for Reuters at the time. I had not protected my staff. There was a lot of other stuff going on around that event as well. The release of the collateral murder tape in 2010 by Julian Assange, the fact that I never spoke publicly about that tape when it came out because I was just so shocked. I just wanted to isolate myself and not have anything to do with it. All of that came together in 2016 and I became suicidal, and it was only at the intervention of my wife that I ended up in a psych ward in Melbourne in Australia, where I got amazing treatment from amazing professionals. That was the first of 3 admissions I had.
All right. First of all, let me stop you there. Thank you so much for first of all, thank you so much for coming on here and being willing to share this. I mean, this is intense stuff. So if we can jump back a little bit, how did you get into journalism in the first place?
I climbed the Berlin Wall in 1990, and it was an event, a moment that I realized I just wanted to. I was a backpacker in Europe, and the wall had come down 6 months earlier. Communism had collapsed across Eastern Europe. It was going to happen not long. It was going to happen soon after in USSR itself, and I just thought, I want to be there when history unfolds. I want to be there to witness history when it occurs. I want to be there when war breaks out. And at the time, I'd done an economics degree and I was working as an accountant. And I just thought, to hell with that. I am going to become a journalist. That to me was just what my heart wanted. And so I found myself in Indonesia a few years later. I got a job. I learned the language, learned how to speak Indonesian, got a job with Reuters a few years later. And that just began a career of working in foreign countries, working as a foreign correspondent, covering international events. It was just an amazing privilege, and I loved it.
So this was 1990, was that 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, so that's 33 years ago, 1998.
Wow. So you begin to experience some these events that happened, and you said you started off by saying you thought you were this tough guy, and which isn't to say you're. Look, let's be clear. It isn't to say you're not a tough guy, but trauma is trauma. How, when you experienced some of the first experiences, or maybe even the first traumatic event, how did you deal with it? How did you manage it? How did you react?
The culture of journalism back then, Guy, was you just drank. You just went to the bar. You went to the pub. My generation, the generation before me, we just went to the pub and drank.
Right.
We didn't share our feelings. It was a macho culture. And there was no such thing as counselors for journalists. There was no psychologists for journalists. Mm-hmm. Journalism has been one of the last professions to actually embrace the need for trauma counseling. And we thought we had to be detached. We thought that it was important not to show our feelings because we thought we wouldn't be able to do our job if we did. Mm-hmm. And so we bottled it up. Basically, that was what we thought. And it wasn't so much we were trained to do, because there was no training. Right. We got all the physical safety training in the world. We were taught how to negotiate fake checkpoints. We were taught how to do first aid. We were taught how to dress a bullet wound. We were taught how to deal with hostage takers. Never taught how to deal with psychological stress. And so when the trauma came knocking, none of us were prepared for it, myself included. And so it was just like, and then so for me, I covered all these events. And then I moved to Tasmania after 20 years of working for Reuters on the road, covering these sorts of stories. I moved to Tasmania in 2013 because my wife's Tasmanian. We moved down here. This beautiful, peaceful island, beautiful place. And you can feel the freshness. You can sense the freshness. Mm. That's when a lot of these memories started to emerge because my brain slowed down. Okay. I was in this place of safety. You'll understand what I'm talking about. But I couldn't understand why this was happening because I'm thinking to myself, I am in this safe place. I'm so far away from places like Iraq. Why is this happening? But because my brain was slowing down and I wasn't so busy, there was now room in my brain and my mind for this sort of stuff to emerge. Mm-hmm. So in actual fact, coming to Tasmania gave room for those memories to start to appear.
So when you had moved to Tasmania, were you still working, or were you?
Yeah, I was still working for Reuters. I was working as an editor then, so I wasn't actually working in the field anymore. but I was still editing stories. Like I was working on the China defense story. I was working on the planes crashing here and there, and MH17 and any natural disaster. So I was still getting exposed to a lot of trauma vicariously.
Mm-hmm. So when things started to come up for you, and obviously I'm not expecting you to talk about what you don't want to talk about, but when things began to come up for you, how did you experience that? How did you react?
Classic PTSD symptoms.
Okay.
Anger, anxiety, flashbacks, lots of flashbacks of me being in the Middle East, bombs going off. When I got really stressed, if I was getting stressed working, I was actually transported back to our office in Baghdad. It was like I was there, that sort of sensation. Emotional numbness, the typical sort of emotional numbness that one gets, and isolation, a lot of isolation to my family, to my loved ones, and a lot of depression. There were some days I just couldn't get out of bed. So the real full catalogue of emotion, right, of PTSD symptoms, had them all.
And did you know what was going on? Did you say,
nope.
Okay, so how did things unfold from there?
Yeah, so I was in complete denial that anything was wrong. My wife knew, Mary, she knew what was going on. She was completely understood what was happening. She'd worked as a journalist in Asia as well. She'd worked with a lot of cameramen who had PTSD. She knew it, but I wouldn't listen to her. It was like there was a couple of things going on. I had sort of convinced myself that after surviving all these events, there's no way that mental illness just wasn't part of my identity. It was just not possible. There was also a sort of a masculinity thing attached to this as well, that mental illness just wasn't part of my identity. And, right. Seriously, it was sort of like, and also the sense that, I loved my wife and I adored her, and she was right about so many things, but I couldn't bring myself to accept that she was right about my mental state until it got to the point where things were getting so bad and it became so obvious that I needed help.
Things became so bad, such as what, flashbacks and all the symptoms?
Yeah, to the point where she basically just said, she broke down one day and said, you need help. We can't go on like this. Even by that stage, even I knew that I was a mess. But I was still working. I was still able to function. But I could see the impact I was having on our kids, who were young teenagers at the time. But this was before I became suicidal. And what was interesting to me when I look back on it, 7 years later, was that, so I took time off. My company just gave me plenty of time off, heaps of time off. But it was taking that time off that I really plummeted, because I took what was initially going to be 3 months. But what happened? I was diagnosed, but I just got more isolated, because all of a sudden I wasn't working, and I wasn't getting any actual treatment. I was sitting at home alone, no support around me, not talking to colleagues anymore, because I was on sick leave. But I was still in this sort of emotional denial about my diagnosis. So I wasn't actually doing any research into the PTSD. And I just kept going further and further. And then at the same time, then the nightmares started. As soon as I went on sick leave, the nightmares started. And I just had this recurring nightmare of being chased through the streets of Baghdad by insurgents, which had always been our greatest fear in Iraq, right? That we'd get kidnapped. That was always the biggest threat for any foreigner in Iraq, was being kidnapped. And then this guilt and shame started to sort of seep through the pores of my skin over the deaths of my staff. And I couldn't work this out. Where was this coming from, and why was I feeling this way? Because I'd locked that event so far into the depths of my consciousness. It was the last thing I wanted to think about. So I'd locked it down. What was my responsibility to them? And that was the last thing to really rise up. And then 4 or 5 months after going on sick leave, it just all came together. I wasn't getting any therapy. I'd been away at home alone, isolated, and I just saw no reason to go on living. Really, the war inside my head. I just wanted peace. I just wanted a way out. Suicide seemed like the only option, and that's when my wife intervened and said, "You need intensive treatment," and she got me into this psych ward.
Did you tell her you were thinking about committing suicide?
So I did, and it was, and I think that was key because, and I'm not sure why I did, but it was just, I think it was obviously very important that I did, because it allowed that communication to then go from me being suicidal to then coming up with, okay, well, what are the options now? Mm-hmm. And as soon as we had in place a plan for me going to this psych ward, which is called Ward 17, and they treat veterans and first responders, as soon as that plan was in place, I just felt this sort of foundation under me. It was like I might get some answers. Mm-hmm. I had no idea what it would be like. I had no idea what the experience would be like, but I thought I just might get some answers. And I just felt like it was just like a bit of something underneath me. And the psych ward was the turning point in my life.
Wow. All right, let's just pause here for a second to thank our sponsors. All right, we are back. So you get into this is an inpatient facility?
Yep.
Okay. So you go into this inpatient facility, and what do you experience? Who did you experience? Share with us any kind of therapist or even peer who.
Look, it was tough to walk in there, Guy. I got to say, I had some frightening moments in my career, right? In Iraq and those sorts of places, but walking into that psych ward was one of the most frightening experiences for me because it's crossing a line. Right. You go into a psych ward and you think, will anyone ever hire me again? Mm-hmm. What does this mean for your career, right? Psych ward, damaged goods. These are the things you're thinking. But from the moment I walked in there, it was just the whole place was quiet, peaceful. Everyone's got PTSD in there, so that was that's a great start. Coppers, veterans, ambulance officers, and it was have your own room, and it just had a real sort of peaceful feel to it. And I met my psychiatrist on the second day, and she was born in Iran and had studied in Australia, and her name was Mariam. And it just so happened that she at one point had wanted to be a journalist. She had, as a doctor in Iran, she had helped with aid efforts in earthquakes in Iran. We actually, before we even started talking about me, we talked a little bit about the Iranian Revolution. And so before we've even started talking about me, we've just established this rapport in those first 5 minutes. And I just felt really comfortable with her. She was probably about 5-6 years younger than me. And we then spoke for 2 hours. And I started to. I spoke for the first 20 minutes, and I was just sort of, going. And by this time, I'd spoken to, a few therapists, but I was typical journalist, rattling off dates, events, saw this, death toll was this, this happened, this period. whatever. She just, she's taking down notes. And then when I finally finished and think, okay, it's time to let her go, she looks at me and she said, Dean, it seems like I've been listening to someone tell me a story about someone else. It feels like she said, you're in your journalist skin. You are telling me a story, but you're not telling me your story. And I sat back and I thought, oh, wow, she gets me. and it was just like this light bulb moment going off. And she said, look, it's easier that way, right? It's more comfortable than having to actually feel your story if you tell it like it's someone else's story. And Guy, that was the start of an amazing relationship because she got me. She was so curious about me, but she also understood my world because she had come from that world.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked, and it was only at the end that we talked about medication. So for her, she wanted to hear my story and understand me. And then it was just at the end of that very first session that we went through what I was on, and then she changed some of the meds I was on. But she recommended that I buy Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, because she could sense that I was really directionless. And she thought, she said, have you ever read Man's Search for Meaning? I said, never heard of it. She said, Viktor Frankl? I said, no. She said, really? And so I went out and bought it the next day. And that book became a real guiding light for me. But they were the sorts of conversations that we had throughout my entire 5 weeks there. And she was just, she challenged me. She was amazing, Guy. She really was, as well as being very experienced around trauma and so on.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I mean, it sounds so inspiring too. Let's jump to the situation where you say to yourself, you know what? I want to help other people. I mean, I want to write this book. I want to start this podcast. I'm creating this website. How did all this come about for you?
So that was that first admission to Ward 17, right? I had I had absolutely no, I never even thought of doing this. Hadn't occurred to me, but then I'm sitting in Ward 17 and I saw all these men and women in these coppers, these first responders, these veterans, broken, absolutely broken. And who had been broken by a system, broken by betrayal, by a system that had absolutely let them down. It's the same in the States. It's the same in many parts of the world. These guys, they get sick, they get PTSD, mental illness, and then they're just thrown on the scrap heap. No longer needed, damaged goods. And I saw this loss of identity in them. And I thought, maybe if I tell my story, I can help tell their story. And that in some way can not just raise awareness, but it can bring about some change. It can help this understanding of not just PTSD, but help employers and organizations understand what they are doing to people when they don't treat people as human beings, and when they don't recognize that, because this is one of the things I've learned, this is what I write about in the book, that the trauma is bad enough for people that they experience on the job, right? In certain professions. What makes it worse is the way these people are treated afterwards, the way the system treats them. So in certain professions. And I found that of all the people that I met in the psych ward admissions I've had, the way they were treated afterwards is actually worse than the original trauma that they experienced on the job. So the occupational trauma, the fighting fires, the fighting wars, going to crime scenes, going to accidents. It's the way these people are being treated by their organizations or insurance systems or workers' compensation has been more detrimental to their mental health than the occupational trauma itself, because there's been so much betrayal in that sense, in those circumstances. A lot of these men and women that I have met reckon they could actually heal from the occupational trauma. What they haven't been able to heal from is the betrayal of the way the system has destroyed their lives. And so, I encountered this on about the second or third day in Ward 17, because these people started telling me their stories. And it wasn't necessarily because I was a journalist. It was just that no one had listened to them before. And I would just say, well, I'm curious, what are you here for? And they just started telling me their stories. And so I thought, well, if I can tell my story, then I can help tell their story. So in my book are some of their stories. And they're just little vignettes, if you like, that just illustrate the sort of the consequences of organizations not looking after their own people. And so for me, that was just a motivation and inspiration to do this book. I didn't think it would take this long to get it done. Honestly thought I'd be done years ago, but these things take time. And that's just been the inspiration for a lot of the other work I've done. And then it was the same with journalists. There's so many journalists out there suffering as well. And so I wanted to do this book for them as well.
I wanted to ask you about your identity, how this impacted your experiences, the trauma has impacted your identity and your subsequent healing journey, how things have changed for you in that respect.
Yeah, it's a great question, Guy. And it was something I really struggled with. And you're the first person to ask me this in a so let's see if I can answer that. I write about it in the book, and I've been able to write about it because I've had time to think about it. So I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this in any way that makes sense. But my identity, I think, I describe what happened to me as an identity wound, right? I lost my identity through the trauma that I experienced because I identified as a journalist. I identified as a foreign correspondent. And the trauma that I experienced stripped that away. And it made me into the PTSD, turned me into a horrible person at home, into a horrible person to be around. And that person inflicted damage on my wife and my kids, and so for me, it's been about my recovery. Has a lot of my recovery has been about building a new identity in which family has been take center stage, and I didn't realize that actually having an identity where family comes first and where family is central to my life could actually be the most important thing. For me, I was just such a driven journalist that I thought, yeah, that has to be first and foremost. But getting to the point where realizing that I can do all these other things, but have my family the key focus in my life, gives me a sense of calmness and a sense of I think this is where post-traumatic growth comes into it, right, as well, because I sort of feel really comfortable with who I am as a person now, because I know where my place is in the world. And it's sort of like the last few years has been writing a new narrative, and with my family at the top of the page, not trying to find that old journalist that I used to be, but where my family gets the best of me in every way possible. And then there's the book, and then there's the other work I can do in the podcast and so on, but they get the best of me. And I've been lucky enough to be able to get to that point. I don't think a lot of people who've suffered the sort of trauma that I went through can, people in these sorts of professions, journalism, emergency services, because their identities have been destroyed, not just by the trauma they suffered, but by their organizations. And they are so burdened by this betrayal. It's very hard for them to regain that identity. I've just been lucky to be able to get back to where I am today. I'm very fortunate.
To what degree did or were you impacted by Reuters? Their response to this?
Yeah, look, it's
Are you still with them?
No, I left about 3 years ago. So, it's sort of it's a bit odd. When I was working in Baghdad and those sorts of places, I had amazing support. Even before we knew anything about PTSD and so on, I had incredible support from my bosses at the time. That they really looked after me all the way throughout my career. But what really troubled me was that towards the end of my career, I got Reuters to create a mental health role. So when I got PTSD, I couldn't work as a journalist anymore. I couldn't do news. It was just too stressful. I got Reuters to create a mental health role for the news organization. So 2,500 journalists. It was a unique role for any media organization. And my job was to create a mental health strategy for the company. And I got so much resistance from management to that. And it nearly destroyed me, because I could see how much Reuters journalists around the world were suffering. I could see how much that it was affecting their work, and I used evidence-based research in the proposals I was putting forward. I used the experts. I tried to persuade. I put forward good arguments. But there was just so much resistance from management to put in place major changes, and it was all because they just didn't want things to really change. They didn't want that cultural change. They didn't want that institutional change to the way things were run. And in the end, it just caused me so much stress and so much distress that I resigned. I left about 3 years ago. And I just thought we could have done something really wonderful at Reuters and made Reuters a benchmark for not just global media organizations, but media organizations elsewhere. And so it was just sad to leave like that.
So I want to remind everyone I'm speaking with Dean Yates. He's got a book coming out. Do we know when this book is coming out? We don't have a title yet.
Yeah, I know exactly when it's coming out, but Pam McMillan won't let me. I'm not allowed to say yet.
Okay. Well, let me rephrase the question.
Mid-2023, we can say that.
Mid-2023. Okay, this will probably go up before that, but we can talk about you getting me the link, and I can help you promote that on my Facebook page and everything else. But I want to mention before we get going here, and as we wind down, you have a podcast. Mm-hmm. And tell us about the podcast.
Yeah, so the podcast is it's for a mental health outfit called Mind Armor, and they are supported by the Black Dog Institute, which is it's actually one of the premier research mental health research institutes in the world. And Mind Armor is a little outfit that does amazing work with a lot of first responder organizations in Australia, a lot of health groups, a lot of community groups. And so this podcast is really about telling stories with people who have done ordinary or extraordinary things in their life, have had mental health journeys, or are doing extraordinary things in a mental health way in their organization. So, for example, I did a podcast a couple of years ago with a friend of mine who survived a light plane crash. in country New South Wales, but killed his parents.
Oh.
And in which he miraculously survived, but later went on to have 25 operations. And he spoke for the first time about that survival sort of story. Or last year, I did one with a fellow who's an expert in burnout, and he spoke about the research that they've done on the medical profession and the consequences of burnout on these folks during COVID. So sort of looking at the various ways, I bring my journalistic experience into these people's lives, tease out some stories, try and tell it in a way that is going to be of interest to sort of an audience that is interested in these subjects.
Awesome. And it's called Mind Armor.
Mind Armor. Yep, okay. Exactly as you say it.
We'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Dean, dude, and I got to have you back. I'd love to have you back. Yeah, to say you're incredible is an understatement, and your story is incredible. Just finally here, how are you doing now?
Yeah, look, I'm great. I mean, as you can tell, I'm really good. It's actually today. Would you believe? I'm sure it's today or yesterday. It's the 7th anniversary of my PTSD diagnosis, and I was thinking about this yesterday. I thought, gee, I'm doing well. I'm really doing well. And I was talking to someone about this the other day, and because people say to me all the time, how writing this book, how good has that been for you? What have you gotten from it? And I say, I have gotten an incredible amount of knowledge about myself by writing this book. I know myself so well. And by that, I mean, I know my trauma. I know my mental health back to front. I know if I'm getting a little bit wobbly. I mean, I almost know it before it's about to happen. And so I can take a course of action if I have to. If I feel myself getting a bit stressed, I can take corrective action. I can do something about it. And I think, so I've got this sort of I've got this awareness of my own state of mind that is so fine-tuned now.
Wow.
That means, I just feel a sense of empowerment that I find very comforting to have. And a lot of that is because when you spend 7 years writing a book, you get to know yourself pretty well. You get to know the science. I mean, I've even gone and looked into things like the polyvagal theory and so on, which I wouldn't have done otherwise. So I think that says a lot for that sort of exploration and how empowering that can be. So I'm really great, Guy.
Wow. Appreciate that. Well, look, I'm looking forward to getting this out there. And like I said, I'd love to have you back at a later date.
Sure.
Thank you again so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for doing what you do, Guy. It's appreciated by a lot of people.
I appreciate that. We'll be in touch.
Cheers, Guy.